Emily Carter arrived in the Bitter Creek Mountains carrying far more than a backpack and a camera. She carried disappointment, exhaustion, and the lingering ache of a life that had fallen apart faster than she ever imagined possible. 6 months earlier, she had finalized a divorce that ended nearly 10 years of marriage. Friends told her she needed a vacation. Her editor suggested she take on a long-term assignment documenting remote mountain communities. Emily chose the assignment because it offered something she desperately needed: distance. The Bitter Creek Mountains were known for their beauty and their isolation. Endless forests stretched across steep ridges and valleys. Rivers cut through ancient stone. Small settlements clung to the edges of civilization, connected by narrow roads that winter often swallowed beneath snow. It was the kind of place where people learned to depend on themselves. Emily rented a small room above the town's general store and immediately began interviewing local residents. The assignment seemed straightforward. She planned to collect stories about mountain life, photograph landscapes, and write a feature about communities surviving far from modern conveniences. Yet within days, she noticed something unusual. The same name kept appearing in conversations: Elias Grayson. An old rancher mentioned him while discussing harsh winters. A shopkeeper brought him up when Emily asked about longtime residents. A waitress casually pointed toward the mountains and said, "You'll probably hear about Elias sooner or later." What intrigued Emily wasn't the fact that people talked about him. Small towns always had local legends. What caught her attention was the strange silence that followed whenever someone mentioned winter in connection with his name. People became uncomfortable. Some changed the subject entirely. Others simply looked away. When Emily pressed for details, she received vague answers. "He's been through a lot. Best not to ask him about the past. Some stories belong to the mountain." Those responses only fueled her curiosity. The more she heard, the more determined she became to meet the mysterious mountain man herself. After gathering directions from several locals, Emily set out one crisp autumn morning. The trail leading to Elias's cabin climbed steadily through dense pine forests. Fallen needles covered the ground. Cold air carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching snow. As she walked deeper into the wilderness, signs of civilization gradually disappeared. After nearly 3 hours of hiking, she finally spotted the cabin. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. Time and weather had darkened the wood, but the structure remained solid and well-maintained. Firewood was stacked neatly against one wall. A small stream flowed nearby. Everything about the property suggested someone who valued order and routine. Emily approached cautiously and knocked. For several moments, nothing happened. Then the door opened. The man standing before her looked exactly like someone who belonged to the mountains. His face was weathered by decades of sun, wind, and snow. A thick gray beard covered much of his jaw. His shoulders remained broad despite his age, and his hands looked strong enough to split wood all day without tiring. But his eyes immediately captured her attention. They carried a sadness unlike anything she had ever seen. Not fresh grief, not recent pain. Something older. Something that had lived inside him for years. When Emily introduced herself and explained her project, Elias listened quietly. He showed no interest in publicity and seemed mildly annoyed by her presence. For a moment, she thought he might simply close the door. Instead, after a long silence, he stepped aside and invited her in. The interior of the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Shelves filled with books lined another. Everything was clean, organized, and practical. Their first conversation was brief. Elias answered questions about mountain life, but offered little personal information. He explained how he hunted, gathered firewood, prepared for winter, and survived in isolation. His knowledge impressed Emily immediately. Before leaving, she thanked him for his time. She assumed that would be the end of it. To her surprise, he allowed her to return. Over the following weeks, Emily visited regularly. Each trip lasted a little longer than the one before. Slowly, the awkwardness between them faded. Elias remained reserved, but he began sharing stories about wildlife encounters, dangerous storms, and lessons he had learned over decades in the wilderness. Emily discovered he possessed a dry sense of humor hidden beneath his serious exterior. Occasionally, she even managed to make him laugh. Those moments felt rare and valuable. The more time she spent at the cabin, the more she noticed details that raised questions. Near the fireplace sat a wooden rocking chair. It was positioned perfectly for someone to enjoy the warmth of the fire. Yet it was never used. Not once. Dust never gathered on it, suggesting Elias cleaned it regularly, but he never sat there himself. Then there were the cups. 4 cups hung from hooks above the stove. Elias always used only one. The other 3 remained untouched. One afternoon, while helping him organize supplies, Emily noticed initials carved into a support beam near the kitchen. S.G., J.G., L.G. The letters were old, but carefully preserved. Elsewhere in the cabin she found drawings, faded photographs, and tiny reminders that other people had once lived there. A family. The realization became impossible to ignore. Elias had not always been alone. Someone had shared this life with him, several people, and whatever had happened to them still lingered inside the cabin, like a ghost. Emily occasionally asked about the initials. Each time, Elias redirected the conversation, not angrily, not defensively, simply firmly. The subject was closed. As autumn deepened, snow began appearing on distant peaks. Temperatures dropped steadily. The forests turned quieter as animals prepared for winter. Emily found herself looking forward to her visits more than anything else. For the first time since her divorce, she felt genuinely happy. The mountains provided peace she hadn't known she needed. And despite his reluctance to discuss the past, Elias had become a friend. Then she noticed another strange habit. Every evening, shortly before sunset, Elias left the cabin carrying flowers. Sometimes they were freshly picked from mountain meadows. Sometimes they were dried flowers carefully stored for colder months. Regardless of the season, he never missed a day. He would disappear into the forest for an hour, and then return before darkness settled over the mountains. Emily asked where he went. He refused to answer. She asked again weeks later. The answer remained the same. Eventually she stopped asking, but her curiosity continued growing. One evening, unable to resist any longer, she decided to follow him. The decision felt wrong the moment she made it. Yet something inside her insisted she needed answers. Keeping a careful distance, Emily moved silently through the trees as Elias followed a narrow path deeper into the forest. The setting sun painted the snow-covered peaks with shades of gold and orange. The trail crossed a frozen stream and wound through a stand of ancient pines. Eventually the trees opened into a small clearing. Emily stopped, her breath caught in her throat. 3 wooden grave markers stood beneath the trees. Fresh flowers rested atop each one. Elias knelt silently before them. For several minutes he said nothing. He simply remained there, staring at the graves. Emily stepped closer. The names carved into the markers became visible. Sarah Grayson, Jacob Grayson, Lily Grayson. She stared at the dates. All 3 deaths had occurred during the same winter, the same year. A cold feeling spread through her chest. Suddenly, every unanswered question seemed connected. The empty rocking chair, the untouched cups, the initials, the sadness in Elias's eyes, the daily walks into the forest. Everything pointed toward this place, toward these graves. Emily barely noticed the sound behind her. A branch cracked softly. She turned. Elias stood several feet away. His expression was unlike anything she had seen before. Not anger. Not exactly. Pain. Raw and exposed. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The mountain wind whispered through the pines. Snow drifted gently between them. Finally, Elias broke the silence. His voice sounded quieter than usual, heavier. Some doors stay closed for a reason. Emily wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, wanted to ask 100 questions, but the words never came. Elias looked once more at the graves. Then he turned and walked away. The falling snow, leaving Emily alone in the clearing, with 3 names, 3 graves, and a mystery far darker than she had ever imagined. For 3 days after discovering the graves, Emily did not return to the mountain. Part of her felt ashamed. She had followed Elias without permission. She had invaded a private corner of his life that he had clearly spent years protecting. The memory of his expression in the clearing haunted her. It wasn't anger she remembered most. It was the pain. The kind of pain that never truly heals. The kind that settles into a person's bones and stays there. She considered leaving Bitter Creek entirely. Her assignment was nearly complete. She had enough interviews and photographs to finish her article. Nothing required her to stay. Yet every time she packed her bags, she found herself stopping. Something about Elias's story remained unfinished. Not because she wanted material for an article, because she genuinely cared about him. Over the previous months, the mountain man had become more than a subject for her research. He had become a friend. And friends did not simply disappear when things became uncomfortable. The 4th morning after the discovery, Emily finally gathered enough courage to return. The hike felt longer than usual. Fresh snow covered much of the trail. Winter was arriving faster than expected. The sky hung low and gray above the mountains. When she reached the cabin, she wasn't sure whether Elias would even answer the door. To her surprise, he did. For several seconds they simply looked at one another. Then Emily spoke. "I'm sorry." Elias said nothing. "I shouldn't have followed you." Still nothing. "I know I crossed a line." A long silence followed. Finally, Elias stepped aside. "Come in." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. Inside, the cabin felt different. Not physically, emotionally. The comfortable ease that had developed between them over the previous months was gone. Every conversation felt cautious. Every silence felt heavier. Emily decided not to ask about the graves. If Elias ever wanted to explain, it would have to be his choice. Days passed, then weeks. Winter settled fully across the mountains. Snow buried the forests. Rivers froze. Temperatures dropped lower each night. By mid-December, most residents of Bitter Creek stayed close to home whenever possible. The old-timers in town began speaking nervously about incoming weather systems. A major storm was approaching. The forecasts grew worse every day. Meteorologists predicted record snowfall, dangerous winds, possible power failures. Emily had experienced storms before. She underestimated this one. The blizzard arrived shortly after sunrise. At first, it seemed manageable. Snow fell steadily while strong winds swept through the valleys. By afternoon, visibility had dropped dramatically. By evening, the mountain roads had vanished completely. Emily had been visiting Elias when the storm intensified. When she attempted to leave, she barely made it 20 yards from the cabin before turning back. The snow was too deep, the wind too strong. She could hardly see her own hands. Elias took one look outside and shook his head. "You aren't going anywhere tonight." The storm worsened after dark. Wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing. Snow hammered the walls. The entire structure groaned under the force of the blizzard. Emily sat near the fireplace, listening to nature unleash its fury. She had never witnessed anything like it. Hours passed. Neither spoke much. The storm dominated everything. At some point after midnight, Elias stood and crossed the room. From a cabinet, he removed a bottle of whiskey. Emily immediately noticed something unusual. His hands were shaking, not from age, not from cold, something else. He poured himself a drink and stared into the fire. Outside, the wind howled louder. The sound seemed to affect him. His face tightened. His eyes grew distant, almost frightened. Emily suddenly understood. The storm was reminding him of something terrible. She remembered the dates on the graves. All 3 deaths had occurred during winter. The realization settled heavily inside her. For nearly an hour she remained silent. Then she finally spoke. What happened to them? Elias didn't answer. The fire crackled. The wind roared. Minutes stretched into eternity. Emily thought he would ignore the question like he always had. Instead, he poured another drink, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than she had ever heard it. I haven't told this story in 28 years. Emily remained quiet. She sensed that even the slightest interruption might cause him to stop. For several moments, Elias stared into the flames. Then he began. In 1998, this cabin wasn't empty. His eyes never left the fire. My wife Sarah lived here. A faint smile appeared, brief and painful. She loved this place more than I did. He paused. Jacob was 12. Another pause. Lily was 8. The names immediately brought life to the graves Emily had discovered. They were no longer carved words on weathered wood. They were people. A family. His family. We were happy, Elias continued. People always assume mountain life is hard. Sometimes it is. But back then, he swallowed. Back then this place felt like heaven. He described summers spent fishing in nearby streams. Autumn evenings gathered around the fireplace. Sarah teaching Lily to bake. Jacob learning how to hunt. Simple moments. Ordinary moments. The kind people rarely appreciate until they're gone. As Elias spoke, Emily could almost see them. A family laughing together. Living in the very cabin where they now sat. Then his expression darkened. The storm started in January. Outside, the blizzard slammed against the cabin walls, as though emphasizing every word. We'd seen bad winters before, thought it would pass. He shook his head. We were wrong. The snow came harder than anyone expected. Roads disappeared. Phone lines failed. Power outages spread across the region. Entire communities became isolated. At first, Elias wasn't worried. He had supplies, firewood, experience. The family had survived countless winters. This one seemed no different. Until Jacob got sick. It started with a fever. Elias stared at his hands. Nothing serious. His voice cracked slightly. At least that's what we thought. The fever worsened rapidly. Within days, Jacob became dangerously ill. Normally, a doctor could have helped. Normally, treatment would have been simple. But there was nothing normal about that winter. The roads remained buried. Emergency crews couldn't reach the mountains. Communication systems were down. The storm trapped everyone. Elias described watching his son's condition deteriorate while feeling completely powerless. The memory clearly remained vivid, painfully vivid. One night, desperate and terrified, he made a decision. He wrapped Jacob in blankets and attempted to carry him to town. The journey should have taken several hours. Instead, it became a nightmare. Snow reached his waist. Wind erased every landmark. Temperatures plunged lower with each passing hour. Eventually, he realized the truth. If he continued, both of them would die. If he turned back, Jacob might still die. Neither choice offered hope. I carried him home. The words came out barely above a whisper. I carried him all the way back. Silence filled the room. The fire popped softly. Outside, the storm continued raging. 3 decades later, the memory still hurt, as though it happened yesterday. Elias closed his eyes. When he died, I was holding his hand. Emily felt tears forming. But Elias wasn't finished. Not even close. Jacob's death shattered the family. Sarah tried to remain strong. Lily withdrew into silence. The cabin that had once felt full of laughter became painfully quiet. Then another storm arrived before rescue crews could reach them. Food supplies dwindled. Temperatures continued falling. Everyone grew weaker. One afternoon, while clearing snow near the property, an avalanche struck. The wall of snow partially buried part of the cabin. Sarah was injured protecting Lily. The injury itself wasn't immediately fatal, but infection followed, then fever, then complications. Without medical care, her condition worsened. Day after day, week after week, Elias fought desperately to save her. Nothing worked. His voice trembled as he described her final days. How she tried comforting him despite her own suffering. How she worried more about him and Lily than herself. How she smiled even when she knew she was dying. She made me promise to keep going. His eyes glistened with tears. I promised. The firelight reflected across his face. For the first time, Emily saw the full weight he had carried alone. Not for months, not for years, for nearly 3 decades. Sarah died before spring. Then came Lily, the youngest, the one who had once filled the cabin with endless questions and laughter. After losing her mother and brother, something inside Lily simply broke. She stopped speaking, stopped eating properly, stopped believing things would get better. Elias tried everything. Stories, games, promises. Nothing reached her. By the time help finally arrived, it was too late. The little girl who once dreamed of exploring the world beyond the mountains was gone. When Elias finished speaking, neither moved, neither spoke. The cabin felt impossibly quiet, despite the blizzard outside. Eventually, Emily understood something. The story wasn't over. There was still one question remaining, the most important question. Elias answered it before she could ask. I never blamed the mountain. His voice sounded hollow. I blamed myself. Emily looked at him. For the first time, he met her gaze directly. I brought them here. His eyes filled with tears. I chose this life. His breathing grew uneven. I was supposed to protect them. The words seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. Jacob died because I couldn't get him help. A tear rolled down his cheek. Sarah died because I couldn't save her. Another followed. Lily died because I couldn't fix what happened to our family. The room fell silent. For 28 years, he had carried those beliefs. Every day, every night, every winter. The graves weren't simply memorials. They were reminders, punishment, a sentence he imposed upon himself. The reason he never left the mountain. The reason he never allowed himself happiness. The reason he visited the graves every single day. Outside, the storm gradually began losing strength. The wind softened, the snowfall eased. Neither of them noticed. Elias stared into the dying fire, a broken man exhausted by memories. Finally, Emily spoke. Just one sentence, one simple sentence. They stayed because they loved you. Elias didn't respond. She continued softly. You didn't force them to stay. His jaw tightened. They chose that life too. More silence. You loved them. Tears streamed freely down his face now. And they loved you. For a long time, neither said another word. Dawn slowly brightened the windows. The storm had finally passed. But inside the cabin, something else had shifted. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Elias had spoken the truth aloud. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, someone had listened. The days following the storm felt different. Not dramatically different, not in a way that could be easily explained. The mountains remained frozen beneath winter's grit. Snow still covered the forests. The cabin still stood alone among the pines. Elias still rose before dawn and followed the same routines he had followed for decades. Yet something had changed. For 28 years, the story of that winter had lived only inside his head. Now someone else knew. Someone else carried part of the burden. Emily noticed the difference almost immediately. The silence that once surrounded Elias no longer felt like a wall. It felt more like a habit he was slowly learning to break. Their conversations became longer. Sometimes he spoke about Sarah, sometimes about Jacob, sometimes about Lily. Not every day, not even every week. But for the first time, their names were spoken aloud inside the cabin. The effect was remarkable. Instead of making the pain worse, the memories seemed to soften it. Emily realized something important. For years, Elias had believed that speaking about his family would somehow betray them. He thought silence honored their memory. In reality, the silence had only trapped him alongside his grief. Now, little by little, he was beginning to remember the happiness instead of only the loss. One afternoon, while drinking coffee near the fireplace, he showed Emily an old photograph. The image had faded with age. A younger Elias stood outside the cabin beside Sarah. Jacob sat on his father's shoulders. Lily clung to her mother's hand. All four were smiling. Emily stared at the picture for several moments. "This is how you should remember them," she said quietly. Elias looked at the photograph. For a long time he said nothing. Then he nodded. But even as the weeks passed, Emily sensed there was still something he wasn't telling her. The feeling appeared most strongly whenever they visited the graves. The three markers stood together beneath the pines, just as they always had. Fresh flowers rested on each one. But during one visit, Emily noticed something she had somehow missed before. Several feet behind the other graves stood a fourth marker. Smaller, older, partially hidden among the trees. Unlike the others, it carried no name, no dates, no inscription, only a simple wooden cross. A chill ran through her. The marker looked deliberate. Someone had placed it there with care, yet it remained separated from the others, almost as though it belonged to a different story. Emily glanced toward Elias. His expression had changed. The moment he noticed where she was looking, his face became pale. Not with fear, with memory. Painful memory. Neither mentioned the grave during the walk back to the cabin. That evening, however, the silence returned. The old silence. The kind Emily had not seen since. Before the storm. Finally, after dinner, Elias placed another log into the fireplace. The flames rose higher. Orange light danced across the walls. Outside, snow drifted gently through the darkness. Without looking at her, he spoke. "You saw the fourth grave." It wasn't a question. Emily nodded. "Who is buried there?" For several moments, Elias simply stared into the fire. When he finally answered, his voice sounded distant. His name was Thomas Reed. The name meant nothing to Emily, but the reaction in Elias's eyes told her everything. Thomas mattered a lot. "He was my friend." The words came slowly. "He lived about 5 miles east of here." Elias leaned back in his chair. "He and I helped each other during the winters. Shared supplies when needed. Worked together whenever storms damaged our properties." A faint smile appeared. "He was stubborn." The smile vanished almost immediately. "Maybe even more stubborn than I was." Emily remained silent. She had learned that sometimes the best thing she could do was listen. Elias took a deep breath. After Sarah was injured, Thomas came to help. His eyes remained fixed on the flames. At that point, things were already bad. Food was running low. The storms showed no sign of ending. Jacob was gone. Sarah's condition continued worsening. Lily barely spoke. Every day felt darker than the one before. Thomas understood the situation. Together, the two men decided to attempt one final journey through the mountains. Their goal was simple: reach emergency services, bring help back, Save whoever could still be saved. It was a desperate plan. But desperation leaves little room for alternatives. They left before sunrise. The weather seemed manageable. For several hours, progress was slow but steady. Then everything changed. An avalanche struck without warning. A thunderous roar exploded across the mountainside. Snow, ice, and rock surged downward like a tidal wave. The force separated the two men instantly. When the avalanche stopped, Thomas was trapped, buried beneath debris, pinned by fallen timber and packed snow. Elias described the scene with painful clarity. The screams, the panic, the impossible situation. He spent hours trying to free his friend, digging with frozen hands, ignoring exhaustion, ignoring the cold, ignoring reality. Nothing worked. Thomas remained trapped. Meanwhile, every hour that passed reduced the chances of saving Sarah and Lily. The decision that followed became the defining moment of Elias's life. The moment that haunted him for nearly 3 decades. Thomas understood the situation. He knew what was happening back at the cabin. He knew Sarah needed help. He knew Lily was alone. And he knew Elias faced a terrible choice. Stay and continue trying to save his friend. Or leave and return to his family. One choice might save Thomas. The other might save Sarah and Lily. Neither choice guaranteed anything. Elias's voice trembled. I didn't know what to do. The confession sounded raw. Even after 28 years, I just kept digging. Snow continued falling. Temperatures dropped. Time slipped away. Eventually Thomas stopped him. The trapped man understood something Elias refused to accept. There wasn't enough time. There wasn't enough strength. There wasn't enough hope. He told me to go home. The room fell silent. I refused. Elias swallowed hard. He told me again. His eyes glistened. And again. Emily could barely breathe. She already knew how the story ended, yet hearing it unfold somehow made it worse. Finally, Thomas gave him an ultimatum. Go home, save his family, or remain there and risk losing everyone, including Thomas. The memory clearly remained vivid. Elias stared into the fire. He made the decision for me. The words broke. He forced me to leave. Emily closed her eyes. She could imagine the guilt, the helplessness, the horror, leaving a friend behind. Knowing there was nothing else you could do, I walked away. Tears filled his eyes. I walked away from him. The room remained silent except for the crackling fire. I never saw him again. For nearly 30 years, Elias believed he had abandoned his friend. The unnamed grave represented that belief. Every day he visited it. Every day he relived the choice. Every day he wondered whether he could have done more, could have tried harder, could have somehow changed the outcome. The guilt became another chain binding him to the past. Weeks later, Emily traveled into town to continue researching local history. What began as simple curiosity soon turned into something unexpected. While speaking with an elderly resident, she learned that Thomas Reed had kept journals. Several survived. Most had been donated to the town museum years earlier. The discovery immediately captured her attention. After obtaining permission, she spent hours reading through the worn notebooks. Page after page described mountain life. Storms, friendships, family, daily struggles. Then she found an entry dated only days before the avalanche. Her heartbeat quickened. Thomas wrote about Elias, about Sarah, about the children, about the harsh winter that seemed determined to break everyone. And then she reached a passage that left her speechless. Thomas had written that if circumstances ever became impossible, Elias would always choose his family. Not because he was selfish, because he loved them. Thomas wrote that any good husband and father would do the same. Most importantly, he wrote that he hoped Elias would never blame himself for making such a choice. Emily read the passage 3 times, then 4. A man who died in the mountains nearly 3 decades earlier had somehow answered the question tormenting Elias ever since. Thomas never hated him, never blamed him, never considered himself abandoned. The journal changed everything. Emily returned to the cabin the next morning. The notebook rested carefully inside her backpack. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she approached. For the first time since arriving in Bitter Creek, she felt nervous. Not because of what she might discover, because of what she was about to reveal. Elias listened quietly as she explained where she had been. Then she handed him the journal. At first, he seemed confused. Then he noticed the name on the cover. Thomas Reed. His hands froze. Slowly, Emily opened the notebook to the marked page. Without speaking, she let him read. Minutes passed. The cabin became completely silent. Elias stared at the words, then read them again and again. His eyes filled with tears. For nearly 30 years he had carried a belief that shaped every part of his life. Now that belief was crumbling. Thomas had forgiven him before the avalanche even happened. Perhaps forgiveness wasn't the right word. Thomas believed there was nothing to forgive. The realization shattered something inside him. Not in a bad way. In the way ice shatters when spring finally arrives. For a long time, Elias simply cried. Not quietly, not carefully. The kind of crying that comes from decades of buried pain finally finding release. Emily sat beside the fire and allowed the moment to happen. Some grief cannot be fixed. Some wounds cannot be healed by advice. Sometimes people simply need permission to let go. Winter eventually surrendered to spring. Snow began melting from the lower valleys. Streams flowed freely once more. Song returned to the forests. Life slowly reappeared across the mountains. One morning, Elias asked Emily to accompany him on a walk. Together they followed the familiar trail through the pines. Neither spoke much. Neither needed to. Eventually, they reached the clearing. The graves stood exactly where they always had. Sarah, Jacob, Lily, Thomas. Sunlight filtered through the trees. For the first time since Emily had known him, Elias did not look burdened. Sad, yes, the sadness would always remain, but it no longer controlled him. He placed flowers on each grave, then stood quietly for several minutes. The mountain breeze moved gently through the pines. Emily remained a respectful distance away. Eventually, Elias spoke. Not apologies, not promises, not words of guilt. Simply goodbyes. The kind he should have been allowed to say years earlier. When he finished, he took a long breath and looked toward the mountains. The weight he had carried for 28 years seemed lighter. Not gone, but lighter. Enough to allow him to move forward. Enough to allow him to live. As they turned and began walking back toward the cabin, the snow melted slowly beneath the spring sunlight. Elias glanced back one final time. The graves remained where they had always been, but they no longer felt like chains anchoring him to the past. They felt like memories, painful, beautiful, loved, and finally at peace. For the first time since the winter of 1998, the mountain man walked away without looking back a second time. The longest winter of his life was finally over.